We do not know what led to this crash, but we have some very strong opinions and ideas, and I think we'll probably state those opinions now. I changed the Obama standards from very mediocre at best to extraordinary. You remember that. Only the highest aptitude, they have to be the highest intellect and psychologically superior people were allowed to qualify for air traffic controllers. That was not so prior to getting there. When I arrived in 2016, I made that change very early on because I always felt this was a job that, and other jobs too, but this was a job that had to be superior intelligence.
President Donald Trump is catching a lot of heat for his opinions regarding what caused or what led to the mid-air collision between a military Black Hawk helicopter and an American Airlines flight. The mid-air collision happened near Washington, D.C., above the Potomac River, and it happened moments before the American Airlines flight was going to land. Dozens of people are now dead, as many as 67 individuals as a result of this mid-air collision. Obviously a tragedy, so immediately pivoting to politics is definitely in bad taste, especially since in that statement, you hear Donald Trump say, we don't know what the cause of this was. So why immediately jump into DEI hiring practices? But there is some truth to what he's saying about what was happening with hiring practices in regard to air traffic control prior to 2016, which I'm gonna get into details of in just a moment. But those practices ended in 2016. They ended nearly like 10 years ago. So to blame this on hiring practices, I don't think quite makes sense. And air traffic control, from what we have heard so far, seemed to be very alert as this mid-air collision was about to happen. The question is, why is it that the military helicopter didn't listen to the instructions from air traffic control? And here's a little taste of the audio that we're referring to.
Go around, climb, maintain 3,000. Blackjack 3, can you return to base? Blackjack 3, proceed directly to Glebe. I need you to land. I need you to land immediately. Can you go to Dulles for a few minutes? Can you go to Baltimore?
And I also want to note that Donald Trump's press conference was riddled with all sorts of contradictions. In fact, it was so apparent that even Stuart Varney from Fox Business called it out. This is not some liberal, this is not some lefty, this is a conservative individual over at Fox News. And here's what he had to say immediately after Trump wrapped up his press conference.
The president came out and immediately blamed diversity. He blamed DEI and the diversity policies of the aviation administration he put blame here. He went out of his way to call Pete Buttigieg, the former transportation secretary, a disaster. He then said, look, he'd heard the tapes. The president had heard the tapes from the crash. He said the air traffic controller told the helicopter pilot to follow him in. That was follow in a commercial jetliner. Then there was a crash. It seems there's miscommunication, and the president did seem to be blaming air traffic control for this tragedy. The president was asked specifically, should Americans now feel safe to fly? And he specifically said yes, even though he had criticized the institution, the Federal Aviation Administration, for its diversity policies. Those policies are still in place. That personnel is still in place, carrying through into the future. And yet the president says it's okay. It's okay. We are safe. Do you see a contradiction in that?
I mean, I definitely see a contradiction. That doesn't mean everything that Trump said during the press conference was false. And I want to get into what he said that was accurate in just a minute. But I think that Stuart Varney makes a good point here. And I'm curious what you think, Cenk.
Yeah, I mean, look, things are breaking down in such an interesting way where Fox News is admitting that Trump is wrong. We're about to show you something where Trump is right. So that's good. That means actual news is breaking out. And so on this though, this particular tragedy, let's be super clear. You just heard, with your own ears, and there's a lot more of it, where the air traffic control is doing the right job. They're telling them to avoid this path. They're very, very clear. So, there's very little things that we know about this crash. But the one thing we do know is that it seems that air traffic control was on top of it. Second of all, if you've ever watched the show, we've got 1,000 criticisms of Buttigieg. But how would you know that he was a disaster and this was his fault if you don't really know what caused the crash or really anything about it? So it's absurd. Here, I'll just put in one comment from a member. Cenk's left tricep or fury on tyt.com said, when we need caring and reassuring voice, our president is as deplorable as possible. He is disgusting. And look, guys, even with the thing that we're about to tell you, is this the time to divide the country? Is this the time to try to make it seem like it was minorities' fault? No, so that is definitely not the right way to go. Nevertheless, there was a program at the FAA that was deeply troubling about 10 years ago or so.
Yeah, and this is the thing about Trump, right? This collision happened under his watch. So he's worried about the political consequences or ramifications of it, even before anyone knows any details about what went wrong. So he immediately goes into defensive mode. And as a result, he immediately picks something that has happened in the past that is not happening right now, because to his credit, he ended this practice, but he's using that previous practice to defend himself against any allegations that he's responsible for the midair collision. That was my read of it. So what he was referring to were the DEI hiring practices over at the FAA as it pertains to air traffic controllers. And about 2 years ago or a year ago, I came across a really interesting report about what was going on and how these practices ended in 2016 when Trump got elected for his first term. So the questionable hiring practices for air traffic controllers were part of an effort to diversify the profession. It's just the way that they tried to diversify the profession was an issue. It actually led to a class action lawsuit, and it's titled Brigida versus Department of Transportation. And through the discovery process of that lawsuit, we've learned a lot about the FAA's hiring practices. So let's get to those details. So previously, each candidate for air traffic control was required to pass this 8-hour cognitive test known as ATSAT, A-T-S-A-T. It was still considered a very effective way of hiring people for the job in 2013, but that actually soon changed because of the pressure to diversify the air traffic control workforce. At that point, the National Black Coalition of Federal Aviation Employees lobbied the Department of Transportation, the FAA, and the Congressional Black Caucus hard on this issue. Soon the FAA commissioned a barrier analysis that argued that the 8-hour cognitive test air traffic controller applicants took posed a barrier for Black candidates. So a barrier analysis by a pair of University of Maryland researchers concluded the FAA relied too heavily upon the Air Traffic Collegiate Training Initiative, which pre-qualified candidates who attended specialized schools and scored highly on the ATSAT aptitude test. So they recommended using a biographical questionnaire first to maximize diversity, eliminating the vast majority of candidates prior to any cognitive test taking place. And so as part of the revamp, the FAA disqualified several thousand applicants who had already gone through the Air Traffic Collegiate Training Initiative and required them to achieve a passing grade on this biographical assessment test. Also, I should note at the time that the FAA had decided to just completely pause the hiring of collegiate training initiative graduates pending the implementation of this biographical assessment, but they didn't inform the students about it. They didn't inform the graduates about it. And they even went on to take that 8-hour grueling cognitive test without any notice that it was worthless, that they weren't going to be chosen for it because there was a hiring freeze in order to implement this biographical assessment instead. But let's get to the biographical assessment questionnaire, because the questions that they asked were insane. They were insane. So in 2014, the FAA rolled out the new biographical questionnaire in line with the barrier analysis recommendation, designed so 90% or more of applicants would fail. The questionnaire was not mentioned and people could take it. It was not monitored, I should say. It wasn't monitored. People could take it at home. You didn't have to take it in like a secure location where someone's watching you. After all, you're just answering questions about your biography. The FAA adopted the new test developed by diversity consultants who were paid more than $1.5 million for their work, without first studying its effectiveness, and discarded a pool of thousands of candidates who had already qualified under a standardized aptitude test that had been used for years. So the questionnaire, as I mentioned, was bizarre in how the importance of the answers were weighed. It literally used, in my opinion, it used some pretty gross anti-Black stereotypes and awarded points for having things like low scores or low grades in science classes, or having been unemployed for the previous 3 years. Discovery shows candidates who rated themselves as poor science students in high school and played varsity sports but were unemployed would score higher than candidates who were employed and had previous experience in air traffic control. It also gave high scores to people who said they were reluctant to express their views in a group, were more likely to be bothered by criticism of their performance, and had less than 3 years of training in air traffic control. Candidates scored 0 if they reported 5 or more years of formal training, and got lower scores if they said their previous supervisor would describe them as accomplishing tasks quickly, or if they said they started earning money after they were 18. And look, what's interesting is it was kind of designed. I mean, if you're answering this questionnaire, you would think like, I'm gonna flaunt my experience because that's gonna give me a higher score. But obviously the way that this was weighed actually punished the students, or the applicants, I should say, who said they had this experience. And so the majority of people would fail, but in the background of all of this happening, the very organization, the National Black Coalition of Federal Aviation Employees, were advising Black applicants on how to answer the questions in a way that would ensure that they would get hired. Okay, so notes from a meeting that they held in 2013 were shared as part of the discovery process for this lawsuit, and I want to read some of it to you. Okay, so they say, we are only concerned about African Americans, women of every ethnic background, and other minorities. Please ensure that you share this information with no one that is identified outside of that. This information is reserved for those classes of people we represent. This is to minimize competition. I mean, it's like super brazen in the documentation. And they were also advised to mention that they're members of the National Black Coalition of Federal Aviation Employees on the questionnaire to increase their chances of getting hired. But I want to be clear that things have changed since then. As Trump mentioned himself during his press conference today, the practice ended in 2016. In fact, in 2016, Congress passed Public Law 114190, which, among other things, banned the use of biographical assessments as a first-line hiring tool for air traffic controllers. People snubbed by the process filed dozens of lawsuits as a result, culminating in the class action suit now underway in Brigida versus Buttigieg. So initially, the lawsuit was titled Brigida versus Department of Transportation. It's now Brigida versus Buttigieg. The documents are public and available to anyone who wants to read them. But this was, in fact, an unfortunate hiring practice that did come to an end in 2016.
Yeah. So on Twitch, one of our members, Avenger Dragon 89 asks, wait, being bad at science was a good thing? Yes, so that's why this is over the top absurd. Look, guys, a lot of things are called DEI now, and some are, some of them aren't. And some of the practices could be great at bringing in more representation at different jobs and not lowering the standards at all. And some of the programs overreach, and this is a massive overreach. And not only does it affect competency and hurt, the population at large, but I would argue that it really hurts minorities to do insane stuff like this. So let me just clarify a couple of things, and then I'll tell you why I think it also hurts minorities. So first, I want you guys to be clear. In the old days, before this program was put into place, they would take the competency test and that would settle. And it was an 8-hour test, grueling, but we got you good qualified candidates. When they instituted this program, you take the biographical stuff first and eliminate 90% of people no matter how well they did on the test. Then among the people who survived that, then they would look at the competency scores, which understandably were were likely to be much, much lower at that point because of the pool that had been eliminated. A lot of the good people were eliminated. Why? Not based on race or anything, but based on this insanity of the standards. So yes, if science was your lowest score, you got an advantage. Insanity. If you had less experience, it was an advantage. If you were recently unemployed, it was an advantage. If you don't take, I mean, I know Anna listed it, but just think about it. You don't take criticism well. You're air traffic control. They have to be able to criticize you at like significantly and immediately. Get the frickin' plane out of the way, right? This is not one of those things that you could have like, a discussion about it 12 days later. We gotta go. The other one was you don't speak out much. At air traffic control, you have to speak out. That's like issue number one, speak out, right? Why would you test for things that give you much worse competency? Because in their mind, and I would argue it's actually super ironically racist assumptions,
yep.
Right? They're like, oh, black people are probably gonna be bad at this job. So let's design a questionnaire to find the crappiest candidates so we can find more. No, who are these monsters who got paid $1.5 million? And now when you put this out into the world, and guys, it's an illegal case. We wouldn't bring it to you if it was some nonsense right-wing source that can't verify it, etc. There's no question about it. And all the as Anna read to you guys, the emails, the memos. I mean, for that organization that's trying to promote minorities in air traffic control, for them to say, hey, now remember guys, this is how you should answer. Already you're cheating. It's outrageous, right? And then don't tell the non-black, non-female candidates because it'll create competition for us. No, this is awful. And so now they'll take this, which is an aberration. Look, I don't know how much of an aberration it is in terms of like, now it makes me want to look at more of these DEI programs, how many were insane like this. But if of the things that I've seen, this is a rarity. But when you have this, well, even if you say, hey, Cenk, shh, don't, I mean, it's so embarrassing, don't tell anyone, right? And don't worry, mainstream media will cover it up too. You can't cover it up. Every right-wing show is talking about it. Every right-wing show talks about a lot of things that aren't true, right? But when this is true, it's gonna get out anyway. And if you're then lying about it or trying to cover it up, then that media source has even less credibility. And the next time you say something that is true, they go, yeah, right. These are the guys who denied that program, and it turns out that program was totally true. So don't do this. We don't, and overall, look, I've said this many times. I've said this for 20 straight years. I'm opposed to affirmative action. Not in the beginning. In the beginning, we desperately needed it. But if we never ever end affirmative action, this stuff like sets in like a cancer into people's way of thinking. Oh, minorities can't do the job. We need to adjust the standards. We need to do this. No, I'm a minority. I don't need your goddamn help. No, where we need the help, whether it's for African Americans or anywhere else, is at the beginning. Okay, so programs like Head Start are super important. Making sure that everybody gets a great education so they have equality of opportunity is super important, okay? But when you say at the end, oh yeah, like let's take my group. Oh, well, Muslims aren't good at this, although I don't know why. But by the way, there is a reason why. For example, that might be true of Turks in Germany. Why? Are Turks in Germany genetically different than me? No, because they're from a different socioeconomic background. So they had different education, different circumstances, etc. Would I want the Germans to cheat to allow more Turkish air traffic controllers? No, I would want them to educate them better, starting at the beginning. So this is an epic disaster in every way. Guys, it looks like air traffic control did the right thing. We can't quite tell yet. Let them do an investigation. I don't think this program had anything to do with this crash. But if you're hearing that Trump's a lunatic because he made this whole thing up and it's not true, in this case, it is true, and not that it's necessarily related to this crash. If you enjoyed this video, that's because of our members. They make us independent, they make us strong, and they make us honest. Become a member today by hitting the join button below.